The envoy of Earth. The station was enormous. Nexus Vera floated in space like a small city made of glass and metal, orbiting two suns that burned orange and white in the dark. Ships from 40 different worlds came and went from its docking arms every hour. Their hulls were different shapes and colors, some round, some long and sharp like needles, some covered in strange markings that no human had ever fully understood. The air inside the station smelled of 100 different things, because 100 different species breathed there, ate there, argued there. It was the most important place in the known galaxy. And Ambassador Lyra Vasquez walked through its main corridor like she belonged there. She was not tall. She was not frightening to look at. She had warm brown skin, short dark hair, and eyes that always seemed to be paying careful attention to everything around her. She wore the deep blue uniform of Earth's diplomatic corps, with a small flag of Earth stitched on her left shoulder, the pale blue marble on black. She carried no weapons. She never did. Behind her walked two aides, both young, both nervous, both trying very hard not to stare at the alien species passing them in the hall. Lyra was not nervous. She had been coming to Nexus Vera for 11 years. She had eaten meals with the Keth, whose forearms moved constantly when they talked. She had sat in silence for 3 hours with a Luum elder, because that was how the Luum showed respect through shared quiet. She had once spent an entire afternoon learning how to properly greet a Hesari diplomat, which involved bowing at a very specific angle while keeping both palms flat against your thighs. She had gotten it wrong twice, and right on the third try, and the Hesari had laughed a sound like wind chimes and said she was the first human to ever attempt it at all. That was Lyra Vasquez. She tried, she listened, she learned. In a galaxy where most species assumed humans were loud, emotional, and too young to be taken seriously, Lyra had spent her career proving otherwise, one conversation at a time. The summit she was attending was one of the largest in conclave history. 40 species, all gathered to negotiate new boundaries for interstellar trade, mining rights in the outer reach, and the question of which young civilizations, including humanity, would receive expanded voting rights in conclave decisions. It was a big moment. Some said it was the biggest moment for Earth since first contact. Lyra knew the stakes. She had written several of the proposals herself. She also knew that not everyone wanted humanity at this table. As she turned a corner near the main diplomatic hall, she passed a group of Ven. There were 4 of them, standing together, watching her with yellow eyes that did not blink. The Ven were tall, almost 2 meters, with dark green scales, broad shoulders, and a way of holding themselves that always suggested they were thinking about a fight. They wore the gray armor of the Ven Dominion, polished clean, with the red sigil of their ruling clan on the chest. None of them said anything. One of them smiled. It was not a friendly smile. Among the Ven, showing your teeth meant something different than it did for humans. Lyra met the eye of the one smiling. She gave a small, calm nod, the way she would nod at anyone. Then she walked on. Her aide, a young man named David, leaned close and whispered, "They hate us." "Some of them," Lyra said quietly. "Not all. And hate isn't the problem. The problem is what they do with it." She had been monitoring Veen behavior for years. She knew they had voted against humanity's membership at every conclave review. She knew their ambassadors called humans the wet planet apes in private, a phrase that had been leaked by a Keth intelligence contact 2 years ago. She knew the Ven Dominion had expanded aggressively in the outer reach, claiming systems that 3 other species had prior claims to, and that the upcoming summit threatened to undo a lot of that expansion. She had prepared for their interference. She had counter-arguments ready for every angle they might push. She had quiet alliances built with 9 other delegations, who shared humanity's concerns. She was ready. That night, she had dinner with the Luum delegation in a private room off the main corridor. The Luum were ancient. Their civilization was over 6,000 years old, and they spoke slowly, as if every word cost them something. But they were fair. They had always been fair to humanity. The elder Luum, across from her, a thin creature, with pale silver skin and large dark eyes, set down what passed for a fork and looked at Lyra for a long moment. "You are prepared for tomorrow," it said. Not a question. "Yes," Lyra said. The Vane will try to delay the vote on human expansion rights. They have already spoken to 4 delegations. I know, she said. I've spoken to 6. The Luum elder made a sound that might have been a laugh. You are unusual, for a short-lived species. Lyra smiled. We make up for it by working fast. She walked back to her quarters late, after midnight by station time. The corridors were quieter now. Most delegations had retired. The cleaning units moved slowly along the floors, humming softly. The lights had dimmed to a deep amber, the standard night setting for Nexus Vera. She passed the central atrium, a wide-open space at the heart of the station, with a high, transparent ceiling that looked out into space. The 2 suns had set below the orbital horizon. Stars filled the ceiling like scattered salt. She stopped for a moment and looked up. She always did that. She liked the stars. She had told Davitt once that no matter how many years she spent out here, she never got tired of looking at them. She went to her room. She reviewed her notes for an hour. She set her alarm. She slept. She did not know it was the last night she would ever sleep. The next morning, at 6 o'clock station time, the central atrium filled with the soft sound of an alert. It was not loud. It was the kind of alert that stations used when something had been found, not an emergency. Not yet, just a notification that something required attention. The first person to see it was a Hesari maintenance worker, then a Keth security officer, then everyone. Lyra Vasquez lay in the center of the atrium floor, beneath the star-filled ceiling she had stood under just hours before. She was still wearing her blue uniform. The Earth flag was still on her shoulder. She was gone. And on the floor beside her, drawn in a substance that shimmered dark red under the amber lights, was the sigil of the Vian ruling clan. They had not even tried to hide it. Within minutes, the news was moving through the station. Within an hour, it had crossed the communication relays and was burning through the dark between stars at the speed of light, aimed straight at a small blue planet, orbiting a single yellow sun. The conclave fell silent. 40 delegations stood or sat or hovered in their rooms, all of them doing the same thing. Waiting. They had seen young species react to things like this before. They had seen rage. They had seen grief. They had seen reckless declarations, and wars started in an afternoon. They waited to see what the humans would do. They did not have to wait long to start feeling afraid. The silence before the thunder. The first thing the alien embassies on Earth expected was noise. That was what they knew about humans. Humans were loud. Humans felt things deeply, and let those feelings out in speech, in crowds, in broadcasts that filled every channel. When humans were angry, they shouted. When humans were sad, they wept in public. When humans were afraid, they talked about it constantly, as if speaking the fear out loud could somehow reduce its size. So when the news of Ambassador Vasquez's death reached Earth, the Keth embassy in Geneva activated its monitoring systems and turned every sensor toward human media channels. The Hesari ambassador woke her staff in the middle of the night and told them to begin logging human communications. The Luum observer, an old creature named Ven Soa who had lived on Earth for 30 years and understood humans better than almost anyone, sat in his room and turned on his screen and watched. For the first 2 hours, there was exactly what everyone expected. News channels exploded. Civilian broadcasts filled with shock and grief. Human social media, a vast, chaotic space that aliens had always found both fascinating and overwhelming, lit up with millions of voices. People cried on camera. People called it an act of war. People demanded answers. Political figures gave urgent statements. Crowds gathered outside the UN Interstellar Council building in Geneva, holding lights and photographs of Lyra Vasquez. The Vian ambassador at Nexus Vera watched the footage and leaned back in his chair. He turned to his aide and said what they had all been thinking. They will make a speech. They will cry. Then they will do something stupid and fast, and we will be ready for it. It was a reasonable assumption. It was also completely wrong, because somewhere around the 3rd hour, the noise stopped. Not all at once. It faded. The crowds outside the UN building were gently asked to go home, and they went. The political statements stopped. The major news channels shifted from frantic coverage to calm, measured updates. Human social media did not go silent, it never fully did, but the tone changed. The rage and grief were still there, but underneath it, something else appeared. A kind of quiet, a waiting. The Keth monitoring officer sent a note to her supervisor. Something is different. I cannot explain it yet. Inside the UN Interstellar Council chamber in Geneva, the doors had been closed for 2 hours. No cameras were allowed. No statements came out. The council was made up of 12 humans, diplomats, military advisors, legal scholars, economists, and one very old woman named Director Sable, who had spent 40 years building Earth's interstellar infrastructure, and who was known, in private circles, for never raising her voice. She did not raise her voice now. She sat at the head of the long table and looked at each person in the room one by one, and said, quietly, "We are going to do this correctly. That means we are going to do this slowly. Nobody moves, nobody speaks publicly, nobody acts until I say so." Is that understood? It was understood. The military advisor, a man named General Pars, placed a single sheet on the table. It listed the current position of every human deep space asset. There were more of them than the conclave knew about. Earth had been careful, over the years, not to advertise everything it had built. The legal scholar, Dr. Emeka Ose, a quiet man in his 50s who had written most of Earth's interstellar legal framework, opened a file on his tablet and began working. He did not look up for a long time. The economist on the council pulled up a map of Veen trade networks and began tracing lines. Nobody shouted. Nobody declared anything. They worked. On Nexus Vera, the Van ambassador held a press gathering in the conclave's public forum. He stood in front of cameras from a dozen species and said, with a thin smile, that the Veen Dominion regretted any misunderstanding, that the sigil found at the scene was being investigated, and that he hoped humanity would respond with the maturity expected of a conclave member. Then he paused, looked directly at the camera linked to the human press channel, and said, "We hope Earth does not do something it will regret." Several alien journalists in the room shifted uncomfortably. The Keth correspondent nearest the door later said she felt, in that moment, a very specific sensation she had only felt a few times in her career. The sensation of watching someone walk towards something they could not see. Earth's response to the Venn statement was sent 6 hours after the assassination. It was 3 sentences long. Earth has received the news of Ambassador Vasquez's death. We are currently conducting a full review of all available information. We will respond when we are ready. That was it. No anger. No threats. No dramatic language. 3 sentences. Formal and flat. Like a door being closed very quietly. The Hesari ambassador read it twice. Then she sent an urgent message to her home government. I do not know what they are doing. That is the problem. Ven Soa, the old Luam observer who had lived on Earth for 30 years, read the statement and turned off his screen and sat in the dark for a while. He had seen humans angry before. He had seen them grieve. He had never seen them like this. This stillness was not the stillness of a species that did not know what to do. It was the stillness of a species that already knew exactly what it was going to do, and was simply making sure every single piece was in place before it moved. He sent a message to the Loom Elder Council. It said, "Do not interfere. Do not take sides. And whatever you do not stand near the Ven when the humans finish thinking." 48 hours passed. The Van Dominion began moving a portion of their home fleet toward the outer lanes, a show of strength, the kind of maneuver that usually made younger civilizations nervous. The conclave registered the movement and sent a formal note of concern to the Veen, which the Veen ignored, which they had done before and suffered no real consequence for. What the Ven did not notice, because it was not loud and it was not announced, was that 3 human carrier fleets had already moved into positions that the Ven's sensors were not pointed at. Human ships ran quiet when they needed to. It was something they had practiced for years in their own space, where no one was watching. The civilian shipping lanes around human territories shifted. Cargo routes reorganized. Certain supply chains rerouted through Allied space. Quietly, efficiently, with no official explanation given. A Keth intelligence analyst named Yura 6 was the one who first saw the pattern. She had been tracking human logistics data as part of her routine work, and she noticed that the small, unremarkable changes added up to something that was not unremarkable at all. She pulled together everything she had and laid it out on her screen and stared at it for a long time. Then she walked to her supervisor's office and said, without sitting down, "They are not grieving. They are not preparing to make a speech. They are not about to do something reckless." Her supervisor looked up. "Then what are they doing?" Yura 6 looked at her notes. "They are preparing," she said. "And they have been preparing since the first hour. We just didn't see it because we were watching their faces instead of their hands." He arrived alone. That was the first thing every delegation noticed. When the human representative walked through the doors of the emergency conclave session, there was no security team behind him, no aides carrying files, no military officer standing at his shoulder to show that Earth had power. Just one man, in a plain dark suit, carrying a single flat tablet under his arm. His name was Dr. Emeka Osei. He was 53 years old. He was not famous outside of legal and diplomatic circles. He had a quiet face, the kind of face that did not demand attention, but held it once it had it. He walked to the human delegation's seat without hurry, placed his tablet on the table, and looked around the chamber. 40 delegations were present. The room was large and round, with curved rows of seats rising from the center floor like a bowl. The lighting was kept neutral, a pale white that worked reasonably well for most species' vision. The air was filtered and climate-controlled to a compromised temperature. No species found it perfectly comfortable, but none found it unbearable either. The conclave had spent 200 years designing rooms that were equally inconvenient for everyone, on the theory that shared discomfort encouraged cooperation. The Venn delegation sat in their section in the upper rows. Their ambassador was a broad-shouldered male named Drak Vel. He watched Dr. Osei settle into his seat with the same yellow-eyed stillness that his species used when they were deciding whether something was worth their time. The conclave speaker, a tall Keth, with 4 arms folded neatly in the formal position, called the session to order. "This emergency session has been called following the death of Ambassador Lyra Vasquez of Earth," the speaker said. "The floor is open for statements. The human delegation has requested the first address." Every eye in the room turned to Dr. Osei. He stood up. He did not use the microphone right away. He looked at the room for a moment, not nervously, just looking, the way a person looks at something they want to fully see before they start speaking. Then he said, in a calm and even voice, 72 hours ago, Ambassador Lyra Vasquez was murdered in this station. The sigil of the Venn ruling clan was placed at the scene. We have spent the last 72 hours finding out exactly what happened. I am here today to tell you what we found, and what Earth has decided to do about it. He set his tablet on the table and pressed a key. The central display screen at the heart of the chamber lit up. What followed was 40 minutes that no delegation present would ever forget. Dr. Osei walked through the forensic reconstruction of the assassination with the patience of a teacher explaining something simple. Human forensic teams, working in shifts without rest, had gone through every recording device on Nexus Vera, the official ones and the unofficial ones, including 3 that the station's own security office had not known were operating. They had rebuilt every moment of the 12 hours before Lyra's death in precise detail. The screen showed corridors, movement, timing, data points connected by clean lines. The Venn had been careful. But they had not been careful enough, because they had not believed, truly believed, that any civilization would look this hard this fast. 3 VN operatives, not members of the official delegation, had arrived at the station 4 days earlier under false travel documents. The documents were good, better than good. Actually, good enough to pass every standard conclave check. They were not good enough to pass the check that Earth's intelligence team ran, after pulling records from 7 different station databases and cross-referencing them with Venn military personnel files obtained quietly through a contact network built over 9 years. The false evidence planted at the scene designed to look like the work of a third party, a fringe group with no Venn connection, was dismantled data point by data point on the central screen. The conclave watched in silence as Dr. Osei showed them exactly how it had been constructed and exactly why it did not hold together under examination. He was not dramatic about it. He did not use angry language. He presented each piece of evidence the way a person lays out tools before starting work, organized, purposeful, with no wasted motion. When that section was finished, he moved to the next. He brought up 40 years of Venn violations of conclave law. Not a summary. The actual cases, each one documented, each one showing how the Venn had pushed past agreed boundaries, intimidated smaller species, manipulated trade agreements, and used their military size to avoid consequences. Case after case after case, in order, with dates and names and records. Several delegations in the room shifted in their seats. Some of these cases involved them, in small ways. There had been moments when it had seemed easier to look away from what the Venn were doing than to confront it. The screen did not let anyone look away. Earth is not presenting this as a list of complaints, Dr. Osei said. We are presenting it as a legal record. Under Conclave Charter, Article 41, Section 3, a pattern of violations of this scale removes diplomatic immunity from the offending delegation. We filed the formal request for removal of Venn diplomatic immunity 36 hours ago. We are asking the conclave to vote on it today. He paused to let that settle. Then he brought up one more thing. We are aware, he said, that any action Earth takes will have effects beyond the Venn dominion. 17 species in this chamber have trade arrangements with the Venn that make up a significant portion of their economic activity. Earth does not believe those species should suffer for the actions of the Venn government. He pressed another key. Onto the screen came a set of documents, trade agreements, economic support offers, resource sharing arrangements, one for each of the 17 species. All of them had been prepared in the last 72 hours. All of them were ready to take effect immediately, designed to replace what those civilizations would lose if Venn trade collapsed. These are gifts, Dr. Osei said simply. Not conditions, not negotiations. We are not asking for anything in return. We are simply making sure that innocent parties are not harmed by what is about to happen. The chamber was completely silent. Drak Vel, the Venn ambassador, sat very still in the upper rows. His yellow eyes did not blink. He had expected rage. He had expected demands. He had expected the kind of loud, clumsy reaction that young species always made, the kind that was easy to deflect, easy to spin, easy to turn into a political argument. He had not expected this. He had not expected an enemy who had spent 72 hours not just preparing to fight, but preparing to make sure no one else got hurt in the process. He had not expected an enemy who had already filed the legal paperwork before the public statement. He had not expected to come to this chamber and find that the ground had already been moved under him without a single sound. He understood, in that moment, that he had made a very serious mistake. Not the mistake of killing a diplomat. That had been calculated, deliberate, designed. The mistake was who he had killed it for. He had killed Lyra Vasquez to frighten Earth, to show the galaxy that humanity's bright, warm, careful diplomat could be taken away, and Earth would grieve and rage and make itself look small. Instead, Earth had gone quiet, and in the quiet, had become enormous. In the front row, the Luam elder who had shared dinner with Lyra Vasquez 2 nights before her death sat with her pale hands folded in her lap. She looked at the screen. She looked at Dr. Osei. She looked at the neat, thorough, patient destruction of everything the Venn thought they had accomplished. She leaned to her aide and said, in the low voice of someone who had seen a great many things over 6,000 years of civilization, I have watched 50 species go to war. I have watched them rage and charge and break themselves against each other. I have never watched one do it like this. Her aide asked what she meant. Most species, she said, strike when they are angry. The anger makes them fast, but it also makes them blind. She paused. These humans waited until they could see everything, and then they made sure everyone else could see it too. Dr. Osei collected his tablet from the table. He looked at the chamber one final time. Earth will respond to the murder of our ambassador, he said. We wanted the conclave to understand, before we did, that we know exactly what happened. We know exactly who is responsible, and we have already made sure the rest of you will not be caught in the middle." He sat down. The room stayed silent for a long time after that. It came exactly 96 hours after Lyra Vasquez died. Not 95, not 97, 96, to the minute. Several analysts in different civilizations noted this later, each arriving at the same conclusion. It was not a coincidence. The humans had chosen that number deliberately, because 96 hours was exactly long enough to do everything they needed to do, and not one moment longer than necessary. It was a statement in itself, dressed up as a timestamp. Every conclave communication channel opened at once. Every species with a receiver got the signal simultaneously. There was no pre-announcement, no warning that the broadcast was coming. It simply began. Earth's Prime Minister sat at a plain desk in a plain room. No flags behind her, no dramatic lighting, no uniformed officers standing at attention on either side. Just her, and a camera, and the kind of stillness that filled a room the way water fills a glass completely, quietly, with no space left over. Her name was Amara Dione. She was 61 years old, and had spent 30 years in interstellar policy. She had known Lyra Vasquez personally for 20 of those years. If she had cried in the last 4 days, she had done it somewhere private, and she was done with it now. She looked into the camera, and she spoke. She called it a declaration of consequence. Not a declaration of war. That choice of words was precise. War was a broad thing, a thing that swept up soldiers and civilians and neighboring territories and histories. A consequence was specific. It had a shape. It pointed at something exact and said, This is what happens." She spoke for 11 minutes. She laid out, clearly and simply, what Earth had determined had happened, who was responsible, and what Earth was going to do. She did not use threatening language. She did not raise her voice. She spoke the way a person speaks when they have already decided something and are simply informing others of the decision. The way a person tells you the weather, not asking for your opinion, not hoping you agree, just saying what is true. When she finished, she looked into the camera for one more second. Then the broadcast ended, and everything that had already been in motion began to arrive. The first thing to hit the Van Dominion was not a weapon. It was silence in their accounts. The Vane had built their military expansion over 40 years on a complex financial structure that reached into many parts of the galaxy: trade partnerships, resource contracts, holding companies registered under conclave neutral zones, shipping agreements that moved goods through systems belonging to 7 other species. It was a web, and it was strong, and the Veen had assumed no single civilization could damage it, because damaging it would require knowing all of it, and nobody knew all of it. Earth's economists had spent 72 hours mapping every thread. They had then spent the remaining 24 hours contacting every species, every financial institution, every neutral station that had any piece of that web, and presenting them with the same simple information. Here is what this arrangement is connected to. Here is the legal documentation proving it. And here is what we are asking you to do. Freeze it. Immediately. Voluntarily. And in exchange, Earth would cover any short-term losses. Most of them agreed. Some needed an hour to discuss it. A few needed 2. None of them wanted to be on the wrong side of what was clearly coming. At the same minute the broadcast ended, every external Vane financial holding locked. Accounts, contracts, pending payments, frozen. The Vane military logistics system, which ran on a cycle of automated payments to supply depots across 4 outer systems, sent error messages that nobody on the Vane side understood at first. Officers called their financial contacts and got no answer. They called again. Still no answer. A Veen logistics commander later described the experience as trying to grab something solid and finding it had turned to air. The Ven home fleet had been positioned in the outer lanes as a show of force. It was a large fleet. The Ven had spent a century building it, and it was genuinely powerful, larger than anything most conclave species could field, and the Ven knew it. They had assumed that if it came to a military confrontation with Earth, size would decide the matter. They began moving toward the human carrier positions when they detected them. What happened in the next 4 hours was something that only a small number of living beings ever saw directly. The recordings were later reviewed by military analysts across dozens of civilizations, and the reviews kept arriving at the same uncomfortable conclusion. They were not sure what to call it. It was not a battle in the way most civilizations understood battles. It was faster than that, and quieter, and far more one-sided. Human carrier ships were designed differently from most conclave military vessels. Most species built warships to be visible, large, armored, broadcasting power. It was a psychological strategy, as much as a tactical one. You wanted your enemy to see you and decide the fight was not worth it. Human ships were not built to be seen. They were built to be effective. When the Ven fleet moved into engagement range, they found that the human ships had already adjusted position twice in the preceding hour, placing themselves in configurations that the Ven tactical systems had not anticipated, could not quickly adjust to, and did not have good answers for. Human targeting was precise in a way that took the Veen commanders several minutes of incoming damage to fully understand, by which point, understanding it did not help them very much. Human crew communication on open channels during the engagement was brief and professional. Reports, confirmations, adjustments. No shouting, no dramatic statements. One recording caught a human ship commander saying, when her vessel destroyed the largest Ven cruiser in the field, "Target down, moving to next." The words were flat. They could have been spoken by someone completing a list of tasks at a desk. The Ven pulled back after 3 hours. They had lost 11 ships. The humans had lost none. It was not the numbers that broke the Ven commanders. It was the feeling. The feeling that the humans had not been surprised by anything. That every move the Ven made had already been considered, already had an answer waiting for it, as if Earth had written out the whole confrontation in advance, and then simply followed the notes. At Nexus Vera, Conclave security forces moved to the Ven diplomatic quarters. They carried a legal order signed, stamped, approved by 39 of 40 Conclave members in a vote that had taken less than an hour to complete after Dr. Osei's presentation. The order authorized the detention of Drakvel and the full Veen delegation pending formal legal proceedings. The security officer who led the team, a Keth named Forek, later said that Drakvel did not resist. He just stood in the center of his quarters when the door opened, still in his formal ambassador's robes, and looked at the security team with his yellow eyes, and said nothing at all. Forek had detained ambassadors before. It was rare, but not unheard of. The detained ones usually argued. They cited immunity. They threatened consequences. They contacted their governments in a panic. Drakvel said nothing. He walked with the security team quietly. Forek thought, watching him, that he looked like a being who had just understood something, understood it completely, too late, and had no words left for it. Across the galaxy, in newsrooms and embassy offices and government buildings and small rooms where ordinary people were watching their screens, the same conversation was happening in 40 different languages. The Hesari Free Press journalist, who had called Lyra Vasquez a friend, published a short piece that spread across every major communication network within the day. It was not long. One sentence near the end of it became the sentence that everyone repeated. The humans did not avenge their diplomat. They made an example of an empire. In the Veen Dominion's capital city, citizens watched the news in disbelief. Their military had told them, for years, that humanity was a young species, a soft species, a species that felt too much and thought too little. Their state media had called humans emotional, impulsive, a civilization still learning how to be serious. Nobody said that now. What the Ven public was watching instead was their fleet damaged, their finances frozen, their ambassador detained, and their government's carefully constructed version of events shredded in public in front of 40 civilizations, all within the span of 4 days, by a species that had not raised its voice once during the entire process. Director Sable, back in Geneva, received the confirmation reports one by one. She read each one and set it aside. When all of them had come in, she stood up from her desk and walked to the window and looked out at the city for a while. Someone behind her asked if she was satisfied. She thought about it. Satisfied is the wrong word, she said. Lyra is still gone. She turned from the window. But they will know, for a very long time, that there is a cost. A year passed. The galaxy did not forget. Galaxies rarely forget things that frightened them, not truly. Not in the way that a person might forget a name or a date. The memory of what Earth had done in those 4 days settled into the quiet corners of political meetings and military briefings, and late-night conversations between diplomats who thought they had seen everything. It did not fade. It became a reference point. Before and after. Before, humanity was the young species. The new ones. Earnest, a little too emotional. Still finding their place at the table. After. Nobody said that anymore. The Ven Dominion still existed, technically. States rarely vanished all at once. But it was smaller now. Much smaller. The legal proceedings following Drakvel's detention had moved through the conclave courts with the same patient thoroughness that Dr. Osei had brought to the emergency session. Cases were built. Evidence was presented. Judgments were issued. Several Veen outer territories were reclassified under conclave-neutral administration, pending new agreements with the civilizations that had prior claims. The Ven military budget, cut off from its external financial architecture, had been reduced by more than half. The species that had laughed along with Drakvel in the conclave forum when he mocked human restraint had, in the months following, made quiet and somewhat awkward efforts to improve their diplomatic relations with Earth. The humans had received these efforts politely, without gloating, which several alien analysts found more unsettling than if they had gloated. You could prepare for an enemy who showed you their anger. It was harder to know where you stood with someone who was always calm. The young Ven soldier's name was Kareth. He had been 19 years old when the response came. He had been stationed on one of the outer supply ships, far from the actual engagement, far enough that he had experienced the whole thing as a series of confusing status reports and a fleet that came back damaged and quiet. He had grown up believing the Dominion was the most powerful thing in this part of the galaxy. That belief had held him the way a structure holds weight. You don't notice it until it's gone, and then everything shifts. A Hesari journalist found him a year later, living in a small transit settlement on the edge of former Van space. He agreed to talk because he had nothing left to protect and felt, he said, that someone should say it plainly. The journalist asked him what the most frightening moment had been. He thought about it for a long time. He did not say the fleet engagement, though that had been bad. He did not say the financial collapse, though that had been fast and total and had left thousands of soldiers without pay inside a week. The most frightening moment, he said at last, was when I understood that they had already won before we moved. Before any of our ships went anywhere, before anyone fired anything, before Drakvel made that speech in the conclave, they had already won. We just didn't know yet. He looked at his hands. They had already done everything. The legal filing, the economic preparation, the fleet positioning, the support packages for the other species. All of it was done before they said a single word in public. They let us think we had time to react. We didn't. There was never any time to react. The time was already gone. He was quiet for a moment. We were told they were emotional, he said. We were told that was their weakness, that when something hurt them, they couldn't think clearly. He shook his head slowly. I don't know where that idea came from, but I know it was the most expensive idea anyone in my government ever had. The Keth intelligence analyst, Ura 6, published a formal assessment paper 8 months after the response. It circulated widely in government and military circles across a dozen civilizations. The paper was long and detailed and used careful language throughout, but its central conclusion was simple enough that most people summarized it in a sentence. We have been thinking about humanity wrong. The paper did not focus on the fleet engagement or the financial strike, though it covered both. It focused on the timeline. It mapped, hour by hour, what Earth had been doing from the moment the news reached them. It showed the precise sequence forensics, legal preparation, ally contact, economic planning, fleet repositioning, and it showed that each step had begun before the previous one finished, that they had been running multiple preparations at the same time in parallel, that what looked like 4 days of silence had actually been 4 days of intense, coordinated, invisible action. Ura 6's conclusion was not about power. It was about discipline. "The human capacity for patience is not a cultural accident," she wrote. "It is a trained behavior, practiced and maintained under pressure. This is much harder to do than it sounds. Any species can be disciplined when the stakes are low. Doing it when you are grieving, when you are angry, when every instinct is pulling toward immediate action that is something else entirely. What we saw was not the absence of emotion. It was emotion under complete control. That distinction matters enormously." The paper was translated into 31 languages. A copy of it ended up on the desk of every major conclave member government. Some of them updated their threat assessments of Earth. Some of them quietly began reviewing their own behavior and asking whether they had any Venn-shaped situations in their histories that Earth might have noticed. Several of them reached out to schedule diplomatic meetings with human representatives. All of those requests were accepted, politely and promptly. The Luam elder who had shared dinner with Lyra Vasquez 2 nights before her death spent most of the year after writing. She was old, very old, even by Luam standards, and she had decided, some time ago, that what she witnessed in her final years should be recorded properly. She had seen too many important things reduced to summaries, and summaries always lost something. She wrote about what she had observed in the conclave chamber during Dr. Osei's presentation. She wrote about the specific way the room had changed as the evidence was laid out, not dramatically, not all at once, but gradually, the way light changes in a room when a cloud moves away from the sun. She wrote about Drachvel's face in the upper rows, and about how you could see, if you were watching closely, the exact moment he understood what had happened. She wrote a new chapter in the official conclave historical record. She was the only Luam elder currently authorized to add to it, a privilege given after decades of service. The chapter was titled with a phrase that would later be quoted in dozens of historical texts: "The species that thinks before it strikes, and strikes without missing." She reread it twice after she wrote it. Then she closed the file and looked out the window of her quarters on Nexus Vera, at the same star-filled ceiling that Lyra Vasquez had stood under on her last night, and she stayed there for a long time, thinking about short lives and long memories, and the strange calculus of grief that turned, in humans, not to chaos, but to clarity. The memorial was unveiled on a quiet afternoon, 1 year to the day. It stood in the central atrium, in the exact place where Lyra had been found. It was not large or elaborate. A smooth, dark panel, head height, with her name and dates and a single sentence underneath, chosen by Earth and approved by the conclave in a unanimous vote. She listened to the stars, and the stars heard her. Delegations from 37 civilizations attended the unveiling ceremony. Several sent their most senior representatives. A few sent their heads of government. 3 species were present, who had never before sent any representative to a human event. Some of the alien visitors wept. The humans in attendance found this quietly moving in a way that was hard to explain the sight of creatures so different, with such different biologies and histories, weeping for a human woman. Lyra would have found it beautiful. She had always thought that the capacity for grief was one of the things that linked species across all the differences of shape and language and custom. Loss looked the same, more or less, everywhere. After the ceremony, when the crowd had thinned and the atrium had grown quiet, Dr. Emeka Osei stood alone in front of the memorial. He had not spoken publicly much in the past year. He had returned to his legal work. He was writing a new framework for conclave diplomatic protection, something with real teeth, something that made the consequences of harming another species' diplomats clear enough that no government could claim confusion about what would follow. He expected it to take another year to finish. He stood and read her name. He had known her for a long time, not as closely as some, but long enough to know she would have disliked a lot of the fuss that had surrounded her death, and would have liked the memorial, which was small and honest. A young conclave aide approached him from the side. She was Hessary, young enough that she had been a student when Lyra died. She had watched the whole thing unfold from her homeworld, through news broadcasts and analysis feeds, and it had been one of the reasons she had applied for a position at the conclave. She had been working up the courage to ask Dr. Osei something for 3 months. "Were you ever afraid?" she asked him. "During those 4 days, were you ever afraid that Earth might lose?" He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the memorial. "No," he said. "We were not going to lose." "Then what were you afraid of?" He thought about it honestly. the way he did everything. I was afraid, he said, that we would not be careful enough, that we would move too fast, miss something, hurt someone we didn't intend to hurt. He paused. There is a difference between winning and doing it right. Winning was never the question. Doing it right was the only part that kept me up at night. The aide thought about this. Did you do it right? She asked. He looked at the memorial for one more moment. Ask me in 10 years, he said. He nodded to her politely, picked up his bag, and walked out of the atrium. The stars burned through the ceiling above the memorial, white and orange and quiet. 40 civilizations scattered across the dark, all of them turning over the same knowledge in their governments, and their histories, and their long institutional memories. You do not kill a human diplomat and walk away from it. You do not look at their grief and see weakness. You do not mistake their silence for the absence of a plan. And you do not, in any corner of any system under any stars in this galaxy, make humanity choose between patience